February 12, 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The wind carried salt and ash across the coral ridges. In the fading light of dusk, a makeshift enclosure of barbed wire and wooden posts stood against the jungle's edge, surrounded by the hum of distant generators and the occasional bark of orders in English. Inside, 143 Japanese prisoners of war sat in rigid silence, their backs straight despite exhaustion, their eyes fixed on nothing. They had been taught that capture was worse than death. They had been told the Americans would torture them, desecrate their bodies, parade them as animals before cameras. Each man carried a small cloth bundle, what remained of his belongings, and a heavier burden invisible to the eye, the certainty that dishonor had already begun. Among them was Corporal Takashi Yamamoto, 23 years old, his uniform torn and stained with the red earth of the island. His hands trembled not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he had been trained to believe. He had heard the stories from officers during training on Kyushu. American soldiers were barbarians who collected Japanese skulls as trophies, who laughed while inflicting unspeakable cruelties. He had seen the propaganda posters in the barracks, caricatures of demonic Western faces, clawed hands reaching for innocent Japanese citizens. Now, sitting on foreign soil with the damp ground soaking through his trousers, he wondered how long it would take before the violence began. The American guards stood at intervals along the wire, rifles slung across their shoulders, faces unreadable beneath helmets. They were young, most of them, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, men who had crossed an ocean to fight an enemy they barely understood. They chewed gum, smoked cigarettes, exchanged quiet words. To Yamamoto, their casual demeanor was more unsettling than any show of aggression. He had been prepared for brutality. He had not been prepared for indifference. As darkness thickened, a guard approached the wire and called out something in English. The prisoners stiffened. Yamamoto's heartbeat quickened. This was it, he thought, the beginning of whatever horrors awaited. But the guard was holding something, a canteen. He extended it through the wire toward the nearest prisoner, an older sergeant whose face was gaunt with fever. The sergeant stared at the canteen as though it were a coiled snake. Minutes passed. Finally, with shaking hands, he took it and drank. The water was clean, cold. The guard nodded and moved on to the next man. Yamamoto's mind struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told. This was not the America of the propaganda films, the America of savagery and chaos. This was something else entirely, something he lacked the framework to understand. The Pacific War had been built on certainties. For the Japanese soldier, those certainties were forged in the crucible of imperial ideology and the Bushido Code, drilled into consciousness until they became indistinguishable from instinct. From the moment a young man entered military training, he was taught that the emperor was divine, that Japan's mission was sacred, that surrender was the ultimate betrayal, not just of nation, but of family, ancestors, and spirit itself. The Senjinkan, the military code issued in 1941, made it explicit: do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. And so the Japanese soldier fought with a desperation that astonished and horrified Allied forces throughout the Pacific theater. On Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, on every contested island, Japanese troops chose death over capture at staggering rates. Of the 30,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan in the summer of 1944, fewer than 1,000 were taken alive, and many of those had been unconscious or too gravely wounded to resist. Civilians, too, indoctrinated with the same fears, threw themselves from cliffs rather than face the Americans. The footage of those desperate leaps from Marpy Point haunted the cameraman who recorded them. The propaganda that fueled this terror was sophisticated and relentless. Radio broadcasts, Newspapers and newsreels depicted American forces as subhuman monsters who raped, tortured, and mutilated without mercy. Some of this propaganda was rooted in exaggerations of actual incidents. The occasional trophy-taking by American soldiers, though condemned by military authorities, did occur and was seized upon by Japanese information ministries. But much of it was pure fabrication, designed to ensure that Japanese soldiers would fight to the last bullet and beyond. It worked. In the early years of the war, Allied forces in the Pacific rarely encountered Japanese POWs. Those they did capture were often near death or delirious, men who had not chosen surrender but had simply collapsed into it. By 1945, however, the calculus was shifting. The Imperial Japanese Navy was shattered, its carrier fleet destroyed. The island garrisons were cut off, starving, diseased. On Guam, Japanese holdouts lived in caves, subsisting on roots and insects, watching their comrades waste away from malaria and dysentery. For men in such conditions, the moment of capture was not a decision but an inevitability, a slow-motion collapse from which there was no return. And when they were finally taken, dragged from their hiding places or stumbling forward with hands raised, they expected execution. They expected humiliation. They expected every horror the propaganda had promised. What they did not expect was a canteen of cold water offered without comment, a blanket thrown over shivering shoulders, a medic crouching beside them to clean a festering wound. Yamamoto did not sleep that first night. None of them did. They sat in clusters, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all, waiting for something to happen. Some of the older soldiers had fought on Guadalcanal, had seen friends die in the jungle mud, and they passed around quiet predictions of what the Americans would do. The consensus was grim. They would be worked to death, or they would be used for medical experiments, or they would simply be shot when they were no longer useful. Every sound from beyond the wire, a vehicle engine, a door slamming, sent a ripple of tension through the compound. At dawn, trucks arrived bearing crates of rations. American soldiers unloaded them and began distributing food: cans of meat, crackers, fruit cocktail in syrup, chocolate bars. The prisoners stared. One man began to weep silently. Another refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. But hunger is a relentless tyrant, and eventually, cautiously, the prisoners opened the cans. The fruit cocktail was a revelation. Sweet, abundant, packed in heavy syrup that seemed impossibly rich. Yamamoto had not tasted sugar in months. The chocolate was dark and bittersweet, wrapped in wax paper printed with English words he could not read. He ate slowly, mechanically, trying to understand. In the Japanese military, rations had been Spartan even in the best of times. A soldier's daily allotment was rice, perhaps a bit of dried fish, pickled vegetables if he was lucky. On the front lines, supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Yamamoto had survived the last weeks on Guam eating lizards and the inner bark of trees. His stomach had cramped into a permanent knot of hunger. And now here was food in quantities that seemed wasteful, extravagant, incomprehensible. The Americans fed their prisoners better than Japan had fed its own soldiers. This was the first crack in the edifice of ideology. If the Americans were the barbarians of propaganda, why were they providing food at all? Why not let the prisoners starve, as Japanese forces had done to Allied POWs in camps across Asia? Yamamoto had no answers. He only had the evidence of his senses, the weight of the can in his hand, the sweetness on his tongue, the absence of violence. Over the following days, patterns emerged. The prisoners were given medical examinations. Those with serious injuries or illnesses were taken to a field hospital and treated by American doctors and medics. Yamamoto watched as a man with a gangrenous leg wound, an injury that would have been a death sentence in the Japanese ranks, was carried on a stretcher, anesthetized, operated on, and returned days later with the wound cleaned and bandaged. The man lived. This, too, made no sense within the framework Yamamoto had carried into captivity. The guards maintained a professional distance but showed no cruelty. They did not beat prisoners. They did not mock them. When a young Japanese soldier, delirious with fever, shouted and thrashed in his sleep, an American guard brought a wet cloth and placed it on his forehead, murmuring something in English that sounded almost gentle. The fever broke. The soldier survived. At night, Yamamoto lay on his bedroll, a real bedroll, not just dirt and rocks, and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent. He thought of his mother in Osaka, who had wept when he left for war. He thought of his officers, who had told him that death was preferable to this. He thought of the emperor, whose voice he had never heard but whose divinity he had never questioned. And he thought of the American guards, who sang sometimes in the evenings low campfire songs in a language he did not understand, their voices carrying over the wire like a strange lullaby. It was on the 8th night that something shifted. The prisoners had been allowed to gather in small groups during the evening hours, under guard but without restriction on conversation. It was a concession that baffled them. Japanese POW camps in Southeast Asia had forbidden such gatherings, knowing that solidarity among prisoners could breed resistance. But here, the Americans seemed unconcerned. Some of the Japanese soldiers began to sing quietly, old folk songs from their home provinces, melodies that carried the ache of distance and loss. Yamamoto recognized a tune from his childhood, a song his grandmother had sung while working in the rice fields. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. And then, impossibly, one of the American guards began to hum along. The singing stopped. Every prisoner turned to look. The guard was young, perhaps 20, with red hair and a sunburned face. He stood just beyond the wire, his rifle leaning against his shoulder, and he was humming the same melody, imperfectly, with a rhythm slightly off, but unmistakably the same tune. He seemed unaware of the sudden attention, or perhaps he did not care. After a moment he began to whistle it, softly, almost to himself. An older Japanese prisoner, a sergeant named Fujimoto who had taught school before the war, spoke carefully in halting English. "You know this song?" The guard looked up, surprised. "Yeah, well, sort of. My grandmother used to sing something like it. She was from, He paused, searching for words. "Her parents came from Japan. Long time ago. I don't know all the words, but I remember the tune." Fujimoto translated quietly for the others. A murmur rippled through the group. A Japanese-American soldier. A Nisei. Yamamoto had heard of them, the Americans of Japanese descent who had joined the U.S. military despite their families being imprisoned in internment camps. The propaganda had called them traitors, dogs who had betrayed their ancestors. But here was one, standing guard with a rifle, humming a song from a homeland he had never seen. The guard smiled, a little sheepishly. "Go ahead. Keep singing. It's nice." Slowly, cautiously, the prisoners resumed. Their voices were quiet at first, testing the boundaries of this strange new reality. But as the song continued, the voices grew stronger, and the guard, still standing beyond the wire, joined in with his imperfect humming, bridging a chasm that should have been unbridgeable. Yamamoto felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement in the landscape of his understanding. This was not the America he had been taught to fear. This was not an enemy devoid of humanity. This was something far more dangerous to the ideology he had carried. This was an enemy who saw him as human. The symbolic weight of that moment, of voices joined across barbed wire, of a song carried from Japan to America and back again, cannot be overstated. It was not a grand gesture. No treaties were signed, No battles halted. But for the men in that camp, it was a rupture in the fabric of everything they had believed. Over the following weeks, small acts of connection multiplied. Another guard, a farm boy from Kansas named Miller, taught a few Japanese prisoners how to play a card game called poker. They played with stones for chips, laughing when they did not understand the rules, the language barrier creating moments of absurdity that punctured the grimness. A medic named Santos shared photographs of his family in California, pointing out his children, his wife, his aging parents. The prisoners showed their own photographs in return, creased and stained, images of parents and siblings and wives they did not know if they would ever see again. Santos looked at each one carefully, nodding, saying words that needed no translation. Asterisk I see. I understand. Asterisk. Food became a recurring motif of this transformation. The abundance of American rations was a kind of propaganda in itself, more effective than any poster or broadcast. Each meal was evidence of an industrial capacity that defied comprehension. The prisoners had been told that America was weak, decadent, collapsing under the weight of its own excess. But here was that excess, made manifest in cans of Spam and peaches, in chocolate bars that seemed to appear endlessly, in coffee that was given freely rather than hoarded as a precious commodity. Yamamoto began to understand that the gap between Japanese and American production was not merely a matter of resources but of entire systems of thought. Japan had mobilized for war by tightening belts, by demanding sacrifice, by glorifying deprivation. America had mobilized by opening factories, by producing so much that even prisoners ate better than Japanese officers. One evening, a group of prisoners was allowed to assist with kitchen duties. It was a trust that astonished them, being given access to knives, to the preparation of food, to the inner workings of the camp's logistics. Yamamoto found himself peeling potatoes alongside a cook from Brooklyn named Kowalski, who narrated the process in a steady stream of English that Yamamoto did not understand but found oddly comforting. Kowalski sang while he worked, old jazz tunes and body songs, his voice cheerful and off-key. At one point, he handed Yamamoto a freshly baked roll, still warm from the oven, and mimed eating. Yamamoto bit into it. The bread was soft, buttery, impossibly rich. Kowalski grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. That night, lying in his tent, Yamamoto thought about that bread. It was such a small thing, but it contained multitudes. It spoke of a nation that could afford to bake fresh bread for prisoners. It spoke of a people who saw no contradiction in feeding their enemies. It spoke of a worldview in which abundance was not a sin but a virtue, not something to be hidden but something to be shared. Asterisk. The psychological transformation of Japanese POWs in American custody was documented extensively by military intelligence officers, psychologists, and researchers who recognized its significance. The contrast between expectation and reality created what some later termed cognitive dissonance, a mental state in which deeply held beliefs clashed violently with observable facts. For many prisoners, the resolution of this dissonance required a fundamental re-evaluation of everything they had been taught. Reports from the time describe prisoners who initially refused to cooperate, who remained silent or hostile, convinced that any kindness was a trick designed to extract information or humiliate them. But over days and weeks, the consistency of treatment wore down resistance. Prisoners began to speak more freely. Some volunteered information about Japanese troop movements, not out of malice toward their former comrades, but out of a belief that ending the war quickly would save lives on both sides. Others simply began to engage in ordinary human interactions, playing games, sharing stories, asking questions about America. One recurrent question, noted in multiple intelligence reports, was about American democracy. The prisoners had been told that democracy was a sham, a system in which the rich oppressed the poor and the government was puppet to corrupt industrialists. But the American soldiers they encountered did not fit this narrative. The guards came from every conceivable background, factory workers, farmers, mechanics, clerks. They spoke with relative freedom about their lives, their opinions, their complaints. They joked about their officers, about military bureaucracy, about the food. This casual irreverence was shocking to men who had been trained in rigid hierarchies where questioning a superior's order was unthinkable. A Japanese lieutenant, interviewed by American intelligence officers in late 1945, described his realization this way: "I had been taught that American soldiers were soft, that they lacked discipline and fighting spirit. But I came to see that their lack of rigid discipline was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength. They fought not because they feared their officers, but because they believed in something. I did not understand what that something was, but I saw that it made them formidable. That something was an ideology of individualism, of personal agency, of the belief that a citizen had intrinsic worth beyond his utility to the state. It was an ideology so foreign to the Japanese prisoners that many struggled to articulate it even after they had experienced it. But they felt it in the way they were treated, as men, not as tools, as individuals, not as expendable units." The singing continued, sporadically, over the weeks that followed. It became a kind of ritual, an informal gathering at dusk where prisoners and guards would occasionally share songs across the divide. The American soldiers taught the prisoners "You Are My Sunshine" and "Home on the Range," simple melodies that required no language to convey their meaning. The prisoners reciprocated with folk songs and military marches, stripping away the aggressive edge and letting the music speak of longing and loss. One night, a prisoner named Hiroshi Tanaka, who had been a musician in civilian life, fashioned a crude flute from a piece of bamboo. He played a haunting melody that drifted over the camp like mist, a sound that spoke of mountains and rivers, of seasons changing, of the impermanence of all things. The American guards fell silent, listening. One of them, a kid from Tennessee named Harris, wiped his eyes when the song ended. He did not speak, but he nodded toward Tanaka in a gesture that needed no words. Music became the thread that wove through the transformation. It was apolitical, universal, a language that bypassed the barriers of propaganda and ideology. When the prisoners sang, they were not Japanese soldiers. When the guards hummed along, they were not American occupiers. They were simply men, far from home, sharing a moment of grace in the midst of a brutal war. Yamamoto found himself looking forward to those evenings. The fear that had gripped him in the early days had not disappeared entirely. He still woke sometimes in the night, heart racing, convinced that the reckoning was coming. But it was fading, replaced by something he could not quite name. Not happiness, certainly. Not even comfort. But a tentative, fragile sense of possibility. Asterisk. The historical record shows that Japanese POWs in American custody had survival rates vastly higher than Allied POWs in Japanese camps. In camps across the Pacific, Cabanatuan, Changi, the Burma Railway, Allied prisoners endured starvation, disease, forced labor, and systematic brutality. Of the approximately 140,000 Allied POWs held by Japan, nearly 30,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of over 27%. By contrast, Japanese POWs in American camps experienced mortality rates of less than 3%, most of those deaths attributable to wounds sustained before capture or illnesses contracted in combat. This disparity was not accidental. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to warfare and to the value of human life. The Japanese military, shaped by the Bushido Code and the imperatives of total war, viewed captured enemies as having forfeited their humanity. The mistreatment of Allied POWs was not aberration but policy, rooted in a worldview that valorized death over surrender. The American military, by contrast, was bound by the Geneva Conventions and by a cultural framework that retained, however imperfectly, a baseline of humanitarianism. American soldiers could be brutal in combat. War is an inherently brutal business, but the institutional structures and cultural norms militated against the wholesale dehumanization of prisoners. For the Japanese POWs who experienced this firsthand, the contrast was revelatory. They had been prepared for an America of cruelty and chaos. They encountered instead an America of bureaucracy and rules, of medics who treated wounds and cooks who baked bread, of guards who sang songs and showed photographs of their families. This America was not perfect. Racism existed. Some guards harbored deep resentment toward the Japanese and made no effort to hide it. Conditions in the camps were Spartan, and boredom was a constant affliction. But the baseline of treatment was so far removed from what the prisoners had expected that it shattered the ideological framework they had carried. Yamamoto wrote a letter home, one of the few privileges afforded to prisoners, in which he tried to explain what he was experiencing. The letter was heavily censored by American authorities, but fragments of it survived. "I do not know how to describe this place," he wrote. "It is not what we were told. They treat us with a kind of indifference that is almost respectful. I am alive. I eat every day. I do not understand it." That incomprehension was the beginning of understanding. By the spring of 1945, the war was entering its final, apocalyptic phase. On Okinawa, the last island before the Japanese home islands, the fighting was savage. Kamikaze pilots hurled their planes into American ships, dying in bursts of flame and twisted metal. On the ground, Japanese soldiers and civilians fought with desperate ferocity, convinced that invasion of the homeland was imminent. The American command, planning for that invasion, projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands. In the POW camps, the prisoners listened to radio broadcasts and pieced together news from guards. They knew the war was lost. The question was how long it would take for Japan to admit it, and how many more would die before that admission came. Yamamoto thought often of his family. His father had served in the army during the war with China. His younger brother was somewhere in the reserves, waiting for the call to defend the homeland. Yamamoto did not know if they were alive or dead. He did not know if Osaka still stood or if it had been reduced to ash by American bombers. The uncertainty was a form of torture more insidious than any physical cruelty. But he had begun to hope, tentatively, secretly, that if his family survived, they might live in a Japan that learned something from its defeat. He had seen what American abundance looked like, what American democracy produced. He had seen that the enemy was not a monolithic monster, but a collection of individuals, flawed and human, bound together by ideas rather than by coercion. He did not yet have the words to articulate what those ideas were, but he felt their pull. One evening, as the prisoners gathered for their informal singing, a guard approached Yamamoto and handed him a newspaper. It was in English, incomprehensible except for the photographs. Images of ruined cities, of columns of refugees, of a mushroom cloud rising over a place the caption identified as Hiroshima. The guard said something Yamamoto did not understand, but the tone was somber. Yamamoto stared at the photograph, trying to grasp the scale of destruction. The guard pointed to the cloud, then made a gesture like an explosion, hands spreading wide. Yamamoto nodded slowly. He understood. Days later, the emperor's voice crackled over a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard him speak. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. In the camp, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. Some wept. Others simply stared. The edifice of their world had collapsed, and in its place was only uncertainty. That night, the singing resumed, but it was different. The songs were quieter, more mournful, carrying the weight of loss and the fragile hope of survival. The American guards joined in, their voices blending with the prisoners in a harmony that transcended language. It was not celebration. It was not forgiveness. It was simply recognition. The war was over, and they were all still alive. In the years that followed, many of the Japanese POWs who had been held by American forces returned to Japan and became advocates for democratic reform and reconciliation. They had seen a different world, a different possibility, and they carried that knowledge with them. Yamamoto returned to Osaka in 1946 to find his home destroyed but his family alive. He worked as a translator during the occupation, helping to bridge the gap between the American authorities and the Japanese population. He never forgot the camp on Guam, the singing across the wire, the bread still warm from the oven. In interviews conducted decades later, former Japanese POWs spoke of their captivity with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Shame, because they had violated the code that demanded death over surrender. Gratitude, because in violating that code, they had discovered a humanity they had been taught to deny. One former prisoner, speaking in the 1980s, said, "We were told that Americans were devils. We learned that they were men. That simple truth changed everything." The transformation of Japanese POWs in American custody was not universal. Some prisoners remained bitter, convinced that their treatment was an anomaly or a trick. Some could not reconcile the kindness they had experienced with the devastation visited upon Japan by American bombers. But for many, the experience planted a seed that would grow in the post-war years into a new understanding of what Japan could become. The legacy of those nights of singing, of shared meals, of small acts of recognition across the divide, is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. It speaks to the power of ordinary decency in extraordinary circumstances, to the ways in which individual actions can challenge and ultimately undermine systemic ideologies. The Japanese soldiers who entered American captivity believing they faced torture and death encountered instead a system that treated them as human beings. That treatment did not erase the horrors of war, did not undo the atrocities committed by both sides, did not resolve the deep moral complexities of the Pacific conflict. But it did something else, something quieter and perhaps more profound. It demonstrated that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. In the decades since, historians have debated the reasons for this treatment. Some argue it was pragmatic, designed to encourage surrender and thereby save American lives. Others point to the influence of the Geneva Conventions and the oversight of international observers. Still others credit the individual character of American soldiers and officers, men who chose decency even when brutality might have been easier. The truth, as always, is likely a mixture of all these factors, a complex interplay of policy, culture, and individual choice. But for the prisoners themselves, the reasons mattered less than the reality. They had been taught that capture was the end of honor, the beginning of hell. They found instead that it was the beginning of something else, a painful, disorienting, ultimately transformative encounter with an ideology they had been trained to despise. That ideology, democracy, individualism, the belief in human dignity, was imperfect in practice, marred by racism and hypocrisy and the thousand compromises that all societies make. But it was real enough to shake the foundations of a worldview built on absolutism and sacrifice. Guam, 1945. The war is over, but the camp remains, a temporary holding space while the logistics of repatriation are arranged. Yamamoto stands at the wire, looking out toward the jungle. A guard approaches, the same red-haired Nisei who had hummed along with the songs months before. They have learned to communicate in a pidgin mixture of English, Japanese, and gestures. The guard offers a cigarette. Yamamoto takes it. They smoke in silence for a while. "What will you do?" the guard asks. "When you go home?" Yamamoto considers the question. "I do not know," he says. "My home is gone. Everything is different now." The guard nods. "Yeah, everything's different." They stand together, watching the sun set over the Pacific, the ocean that had carried them both so far from where they began. The wire still separates them, but it feels less solid now, less absolute. In the distance, someone begins to sing. A prisoner or a guard, Yamamoto cannot tell. The melody is familiar, one of the songs they have shared across the months. Others join in, voices rising in the warm evening air. Yamamoto thinks of his grandmother's song, the one the guard had recognized. He thinks of the bread, the chocolate, the small kindnesses that had dismantled his certainties. He thinks of the propaganda he had believed and the reality he had encountered. He does not have the words yet to explain the transformation, but he feels it, solid and undeniable as the ground beneath his feet. The singing continues, a fragile thread of connection in a world shattered by war. It is not redemption. It is not reconciliation. It is simply a moment of shared humanity, a recognition that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the ideologies, there are only men, singing because singing is what men do when they are far from home and longing for something they cannot name. And in that moment, Yamamoto understands that the war is truly over. Not because the emperor said so, not because the bombs fell and the cities burned, but because he can stand here on foreign soil and hear his enemy's voice joined with his own, creating something new from the ruins of everything that came before. The sun dips below the horizon. The stars begin to appear, the same stars that shine over Osaka and Kansas and Brooklyn and all the distant homes that wait for soldiers to return. The singing fades into silence. The camp settles into night. And in the darkness, a man who had been taught to fear capture more than death lies down to sleep and dreams of going home.